Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with our next recorded lecture. This is the Purves and Kaufman piece. We're continuing talking about this. We're talking about the badness of death, right? We looked at Epicurus and he said, look, if you're here, death is not here. But once death is here, you're not here. So there's no subject for death to be bad to. And we talked about how death has to be bad to you at a certain time. But during the time that death is here, you're not here. So it's not bad. We looked at a few responses to this, right? And the last response we looked at was the idea of deprivation of life, that death is bad for you before you die because it therefore deprives you of good things. And this is the sort of the Kaufman piece, right? The Kaufman response. So with that said, now that we're caught up, let's go ahead and finish up our slides. We don't have too much, but let's go ahead and look at Lucretius's symmetry argument. So again, Kaufman says that death is bad for you before you die because it prevents you from continuing and experiencing good things in life. So here's Lucretius. He's another ancient philosopher, and he anticipates this response. He anticipates the idea that death is bad for you before you die because it deprives you of good things. He says this: look back again to see how the past ages of everlasting time, before we were born, have been as naught to us, have been of no concern to us. These then nature holds up to us as a mirror of the time that is to come. When we are dead and gone, is there anything that looks terrible in this? Anything that seems gloomy? Is it not calmer rest than any sleep? In other words, when you die, there's an infinity beyond the moment of your death where you are nothing. There's no consciousness there. And that seems scary. But before you had consciousness, there was also an infinity of time before you. But you're not scared of that. In fact, that is of no concern to you. In other words, not being born earlier also deprives us of good experiences, just as dying does deprive us of good experiences. However, we don't consider it bad for us to not be born earlier. Thus, not dying later must also not be bad for us. Think about that. Do you actually wish to be born earlier? If we say that death is bad for us because it deprives us of life, then we must also be suffering because we weren't born earlier. And we should want to be born as earlier as possible. What are some responses to Lucretius? Strategy 1. Admit that the two situations, not being born earlier and not dying later, are the same. Both deprive us of good experiences. However, both are actually bad for us. It is counterintuitively bad that we were not born earlier. And here's strategy 2. Argue that the two situations are somehow just not the same, that there's a difference somehow. There's a few ways you can sort of do this, right? The first claim is to say that we simply have a preference for future goods as opposed to past goods. But this is problematic. Lucretius' whole argument is that such a preference is irrational, that you shouldn't prefer future goods as opposed to past goods. When we talk about the goodness of life, we should consider it holistically. When both dying early and being born late deprive us of goods that make our life as a whole better. Here's the second way of going about it. Claim that we cannot be the same person if we were born earlier, but we can be the same person if we died later. This is because if we were born earlier, we would have been formed by a different gametes, sperm and egg. But there's also a problem for this, right? In vitro fertilization, science exists now. We can have the same gametes being born earlier or later. So if you were born via in vitro fertilization, did you suffer because your parents didn't make you be born earlier as opposed to later? Again, the same exact gametes. Here's a third way of going about it. Claim that even though I'd be born earlier, say 20 years from now, with the same gametes, my life history would just be drastically different. I would not be the same autobiographical person with the same experiences. Okay, yeah, there's a problem with this too, however. This is obviously the case, right? If you were born 20 years earlier with the same gametes, and again, you're the same person biologically. But again, historically, because you're born 20 years earlier, you might just be a very different person. So therefore, you won't care about that person. But what about cases in which you could have been born just a month earlier, a week earlier, a day, a minute? Would you have really had drastically would you have really had drastically different life experiences? It doesn't seem to be the case. So here are some takeaway questions. Remember, we're assuming that death is the end of all consciousness. If you have a different description of death, great, go ahead and use it. But if you use it, then you're not speaking the same language as these philosophers. So I encourage you to speak the same language so you can sort of engage with them. The question is that death bad for us? And if so, when? And secondly, regardless of whether death is bad or not bad, is fearing death rational? If not, should we fear death even if it is irrational? What do you think? Well, with that said, folks, that's all I have for you. Take it easy. Have a good day. Bye-bye.